On December 11th, the NAACP Health Committee sponsored a panel discussion and conversation about how to deal with anxiety, stress, and depression during the COVID pandemic. Here is that conversation.
Diversity and social work, and had the opportunity to do some fellowships in combination with Howard University and Georgetown University. My specialties, I won't go too long. Brevity is not my strong suit, as Kevin knows, but my specialties were in mental health and medical social work, and I worked in special immunology primarily, and that was working with pediatric AIDS and HIV, as well as with pediatric oncology, and just the development of trauma in medical settings for youth and their families, and then transitioned really into doing work very specifically when we came here, moved here to the Washington state area and then to the east side, and really working very specifically with Black, Latinx youth of color, and doing leadership groups and supports for our students of color in this area. And that has been my main focus for over a decade. And that's the focus of Eastside Youth Coalition, that we are working to uplift, enhance, support, engage, and provide safe spaces for youth of color on the East Side.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think you all know me. I'm Kevin Henry. My main job is coordinating the diversity, equity, and inclusion training for sound, in parentheses, mental health. I say that just because there's a real strong emphasis on that, even though we're a healthcare organization. I'm also a co-chair along with Mike of the Seattle NAACP Health Committee. Over to you, Alyssa.
Hi. Oh, which Alyssa? Speaker Alyssa?
Oh, I'm sorry, Alyssa Pike.
Over to me? Okay. Hi, I'm Alyssa Pike. I am the NAACP Health Committee Secretary, and I'm currently working in school-based health as well.
Thank you. And now we're going to go, I'm doing it in order of who's on my screen. So we're going to go over to Mike, who's done eating, I think.
Yeah, my first meal in a few hours. So my name is Mike. I'm a counselor. I'm also a nurse, but primarily doing counseling work right now. I've worked in various organizations. I started out at DSC, working downtown with the homeless population with co-occurring disorders, helping people get off the streets and get into housing and get into work, and advocating for vulnerable adults, people with severe mental illness and other comorbidities. I've moved on since then to working primarily in crisis counseling. I work as a mental health professional supervisor at Kitsap Mental Health on the weekends. I actually just got off work, which, I mean, pretty tiring working and coming in and doing this stuff, but I'm glad to do it. And I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I've been licensed since January. I graduated in 2017 from Winston-Salem State University, historically Black college in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm also a certified rehabilitation counselor and a licensed practical nurse. And I'm also co-chair of the NAACP Health Committee, and I'm also a participant provider at school. So South King Emotional Wellness League, which provides free mental health screenings for the King County community, as well as, state of Washington at large. So that's what I do, and glad to do it.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike. Over to Shashim.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, perfect, great. So my name is Sashim Solange Silkazero, and I'm a mental health professional as well. I originally from Washington, but lived out of state for a while, did undergraduate work at Vassar, and then got a MA in clinical psychology at Antioch, LA, and came back to Washington and had a psychotherapy practice and did some crisis work in rural Washington until I came into Seattle again. And I've been working in community mental health in Seattle. And currently I'm the program manager of what can be called the Behavioral Health Outreach Program. It was called Housing Outreach, but this was originally a mid program, started through an RFP process with King County Behavioral Health and Recovery Division to support people with behavioral health and health concerns that actually compromise housing instability. So we primarily focus on doing outreach and engagement work and crisis work with residents of Seattle Housing Authority so that they can just be empowered to find health resources and supports and healthcare that promote their own stability and quality of life, and not have housing be compromised because of health reasons and documented disabilities or anything like that. So the work really varies, and again, I'm a mental health professional like many of you. So that's me.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. Let's go over to the second Alyssa Pizzaro.
Yes, so I am not a mental health professional. I am a yoga instructor and I work in the nonprofit sector. I came into yoga and stepped into spaces where yoga, movement, breath was not being explored. So I've been an instructor at juvenile detention centers, specifically in Tacoma. And I also have been a yoga instructor in a youth homeless shelter, as well as in senior living facilities. And so, I have explored yoga for many reasons, mainly because yoga, exploring my own trauma and how it manifested and how to cope with that. So I really enjoy that. And then also, as I said, I work in the nonprofit sector, and I am drawn to social justice. I am also a certified diversity facilitator. So I work also having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for having me.
Great, thank you for being here. Over to a brief introduction from William Bear. Mr. Bear, you're on.
So I've been involved with USOR for the last year or so, which is United Shoreline Organized Against Racism. And we've been meeting every Wednesday and trying to figure out some things we can do to make our city shoreline anti-racist. We've been engaged with conversations with the police department and the city manager's office, trying to figure out ways we can make things better. We're very interested in non-police responses to mental health crisis. So the model in Eugene, Oregon, something that we're encouraging. And other than that, I've been a paraeducator, and I've been mental health. I've been working in Celebrate Recovery, helping people deal with all kinds of addictions. I'm very interested in adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care. I think I'll stop there. Thanks. Good to be here. My name is Bill.
Good to have you. Now I'm thinking Nori might be able to just introduce herself, but I'm not sure because she's in the middle of a wrestling match, hopefully not actually in the ring. Nori, are you able to, okay, we'll leave Nori alone for a minute. Annette, oh wait, no, go back to Nori. You're there.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me, and it's really loud here, but just wanted to join for as long as I can, just in listening mode. I'm with Public Health and Tobacco Prevention. I'm also the Community Wellbeing Initiative Coordinator, coordinating behavioral health providers and plugging them into support with the community. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you, Nori. Over to Annette, familiar face.
Good morning. I just want to say at first that I have another commitment at 11 o'clock, so I'm going to need to bow out at 11 o'clock. I heard about this from Kevin through our USOR meeting, so I wanted to be sure and come here and attend. I'm not a mental health professional. I don't work in the industry. I have a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology, and I currently work for a state agency that my focus is on preventing pollution. So a lot of the owners I work with are English as a second language. And I'm just here today to listen and learn. So, and I'm, of course, a member of USOR like Bill and Kevin. So glad to be here.
Great. Thanks for being here, Annette. And last but not least, Mr. Kevin Allen, who I've known for a long time, has done a lot of great work in the community. Kevin, are you able to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm kind of like, this is a de-stress day, so I wanted to tune in. And I'm not at my computer desk, so I'm kind of like moving around and de-stress before I get back to get busy. And I'm a Social Security disability adjudicator, as well as a board member of the NAACP. And I'm interested in the topic because I read a lot of medical evidence. I read for people who apply for Social Security disability, that they have mental concerns, to see therapists, and to read the actual notes and try to determine if they're eligible. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but the one word that I was going to throw out there that I think about with that is the word denial. And I had to deal with that myself, just even to when I admitted to somebody that sometimes I have down days too. They said, no, not you. I said, yes, I do. So I know denial and pride is a word, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, especially in people of color and in other underserved spaces where it's stigmatized. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kevin, for being here. Good to see you. Well, so here's how it'll work today. And we have a small group, so it's nice to, I think it'll be more of a discussion. But first, I would like to give you the outline. What I'm going to do as the facilitator is talk to each of the panelists. We have Michelle, Alyssa, and Shashim for about 10 minutes. I have just some questions for them about their individual work in certain fields. And then after I talk to each one of them for about 10 minutes, we'll then have more of a general panel discussion where any of the panelists can answer the question, depending on what it is, or all three, or one person, two of you, whatever works. And then the remainder of the event, we'll just have more of a discussion. I also want to have Mike talk about his work at the end of the first part of the panel, his work with school and just his work in the mental health field, because he's done a lot of great work. And in fact, he was just featured in the Seattle Times, I think. So now you're a celebrity. It's a great interview he did. But I wanted to start off with Alyssa Pizzaro and talk for about 10 minutes about yoga. And I know my wife does yoga. She loves it. I know a lot of people do it. We're living in a time where, life can be stressful enough, but you take the last couple of years and you look at the protests, the murder of George Floyd, COVID, all of the controversy around the vaccines. Do I take it? Don't I take it? The uncertainty of the future. It's like I used to be a planner, and I'm like going, well, I don't even want to plan a trip because I don't even know, am I going to be able to make it? How are the rules going to be changed? And I think that Kevin brought up a good point when he used that word denial, because I think inherently, if we feel like we're strong people, or people tell us, well, you're strong, you're tough, you can deal with it, we internalize a lot of things. And then when you add racialized trauma and different types of personal trauma that you're trying to suppress, it's bound to come out in some kind of way. So it might come out in anger, substance abuse, depression, anxiety, a number of ways. And so I just wanted to kind of touch on different areas and just be able to talk about that and just learn from it. So Alyssa, my first question is, for the person who says, I heard that yoga, I heard something about that's supposed to relax you and reduce anxiety. How would you respond to that? And just kind of explaining the basics of what yoga is and what the benefits are.
Yeah, thank you for that. If somebody were to say that to me, I would say sometimes. That would be my response, because what yoga is a tool, right? Let me step back, actually. Yoga can be many things to many different people. There are folks, and the origins of yoga come from a spiritual place. So I want to acknowledge that. The yoga that I am speaking about right now is connected to the actual origins of yoga. However, the difference is that the yoga that I practice and that I teach is trauma-informed yoga. And so it's not that it's different, but it's shining a light on different elements of yogic practice. So if somebody were to say to me that they heard that it's calming, and it can, yes, it can do that. And it can also bring up a lot of things. So yoga, the definition of yoga is yoke to yoke. So it's union. It's to bring all of your bodies, so spiritual body, physical body, mental body, all of it together. So if you have some element that is off balance, dis-ease, a disease, but more dis-ease in any of those bodies, it is possible that yoga is actually going to make you feel pretty not good. And that happens frequently. And the purpose of yoga is that it's not a prescription, right? You're not taking this to get this. It's a tool to open up a possibility of a new way of moving, of breathing, of thinking. And that's what it is. It's not, much like many other tools where there's movement involved and breathing, folks can feel the same way that they do feel when they do yoga as when they're dancing or singing or chanting, doing many, many different types of movements and, ways of bringing in some of the elements that can calm your nervous system, like singing and humming and things like that, that can really allow your mental body to rest and digest. So there's a lot of that can happen, just as it can also spark some, I don't care for the word triggered. However, it can spark an activation so that you can bring awareness to something that might be off kilter, let's say. I hope that explains.
Yeah, and yeah, it does. And I'm wondering, do you find with people who you've worked with, and I also want to find out about your work with yoga behind bars in particular, that people have a tendency to repress or suppress a lot of anxiety, stress. We live in a society, I think, in this one in particular, where we're told to, do it your way, be tough, don't let it get to you, take the high road. I really like that one, because I'm thinking, when you're dealing with some, I don't know, you're dealing with some stressful person at work or in your personal life, and they're maybe taking the low road. And take the high road. Don't let it bother you. Don't let it upset you. So what are some of the challenges that you have with people that you worked with? And then we could segue into yoga behind bars, because I'd really like to hear about that as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It brings up a really important point, because what we do is we want to be able to, as I said, bring all of these elements of ourself together and from a truthful space. And that's not always easy, right? And so what's commonly said is what happens on your mat is a reflection of what's off your mat. So what you don't want to do is bypass, which is like, take the higher road. Oh, that's no big deal. That is not the purpose. The purpose is to be able to be I'm trying really hard not to cuss. I'm just, just so you know.
I can bleep it out later, you know.
You got to be in the shit, you know, like sometimes that's just how it is. That's life, right? It's what's interesting is what you brought up initially was, you know, you don't want to make plans. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's always uncertainty in life, right? We have an illusion that we have been told and sold and that we believe for the comforts of ourselves that there is something that we can count on, that it will always be this. And that is the farthest thing from the truth. So once we're able to say that is not true, that is, you know, and not from a place of trying to freak everybody out, but just kind of be allowing it to be normalized, then I think there's truthfulness. So coming from a place of a truth that exists for everybody, which is that there's nothing that's planned, there's nothing guaranteed. We all are struggling. We all have, you know, there's nothing, you know, this taking the high road or, you know, suck it up, which, you know, again, as you were mentioning, my father is an immigrant from Panama. You know, so there's an immigrant mentality a lot of times that's taken on in our culture. There is obviously BIPOC, particularly Black, and I would say also Asian idea of, but all BIPOC. I don't want to single any out, but where that's this idea where, you know, don't let it hurt you. You know, you don't let that affect you, and it's the whole point that it does end up affecting, which we all know it does. Like it, you know, there's nobody is immune. So it's being able to use that as a truth too, so that you can get healthy for yourself and whatever that means for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that, that there's a lot of folks that I've worked with in the environments that I've been in, where that is really what folks feel, that they shouldn't be feeling this way. They shouldn't be sad or angry and those are all normal. So it's like, how can we normalize human feelings, right? So that they won't become overwhelming and take over our actions.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And before you get into yoga behind bars, as you were talking, I was thinking of microaggressions, code switching, things that where as a person of color, we're internalizing things. Like the other day, a friend of mine sent me a photo of a building that somewhere in Virginia where they still had the white and colored sign entrances on the building, and they would not take it down. And in order to go into the post office in this city and a little town in Virginia, you had to walk through those doors, literally. So I'm thinking that kind of has a little bit of a triggering effect with me. But at the same time, in my mind, I'm going, well, don't let it bother you. Hey, so yoga behind bars, talk just a little bit about that, your experience with that.
Yeah. So Yoga Behind Bars is a nonprofit organization that takes yoga to incarcerated facilities throughout Washington State. And I formerly was not staff member. I did also teach, as I mentioned earlier, the juvenile detention hall for about 2 years, co-taught. And so the idea behind this is to be able to, as I said earlier, to be able to not only normalize feelings, but also to bring in a space, right, and breath. So yoga sometimes for some people, right, because like I said, it's not a prescription, will allow folks to be able to interrupt something. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you know, typically when you're doing yoga, there's a movement, right? You'll do a movement. Let's say you reach your arms up, you'll pause and bring your arms down and pause again, and perhaps be invited with trauma-informed yoga, be invited to notice how you feel. So that, you know, creating a new way of kind of like a way that your body's moving and your brain is thinking about movement, invites you to be able to interrupt automatic reactions, which a lot of times come from a trauma response, particularly in facilities that are of incarceration.
Mhm.
With that said, we don't want folks in their rest and digest all the time, because that is not an area that is not safe in those spaces, right? We don't want folks to be, relaxed, because the reality of incarceration is that it is traumatizing in and of itself. The facility, the actions, it's a punishment and penalization of people, right? That's the purpose of incarceration. So to get people to be in a rest and digest is irresponsible. We don't want folks to feel that way all the time, but we invite people to feel it and tap into it sometimes when it's safe, when they're in a space where they can be held in that way, if it's in a class or maybe in their own cell. So it's being able to invite that, like it invites pause in an appropriate way for folks, in my opinion.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. And we'll circle back to some of the points that you made. I wanted to go over to Shashim, who I've had the pleasure of working with at Sound. And as we were talking about just kind of like what Shashim was going to talk about, one thing I kind of touched on was I had met Shashim at one of our programs at Sound within a housing development. And it just occurred to me, in seeing the residents there and kind of what they were dealing with and the challenges, I'm thinking, when I complain because the internet's wonky, or I have my little episodes where I'm, bitching about something, I'm thinking, wow, these people have some real challenges. So I wanted to find out, my first question, Shashim, really is given the theme of today with stress, anxiety, and the people that you work with, what are you seeing, and how, and what are some of the ways, or through resources or programs, that people can meet some of these challenges?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm someone who's also been drawn to social justice work, and the work of like framing social issues and ways that we can combat them systemically. So I'm gonna take a little bit of a moment to answer this question, but
Sure.
Because it relates to what Alyssa was saying. But so I was living in Brooklyn and working in nonprofits and publishing when I wanted to get a degree in counseling. And part of the reason why I went to LA is because at that time, the late 2000s, I felt like there were a lot of institutions in California that were integrating mindfulness, yoga, and clinical work. And so I was really drawn to understand, how these things were related, and I also had found yoga to be really beneficial for myself. And I just wanted to have that holistic framework when I went into the field. And I even have a publishing colleague who became a social worker. Now she works at an organization called the Lineage Project, which I think is similar to what Alyssa's doing, in that it's a program that brings, it facilitates yoga for people of all backgrounds and for youth especially. And so I just want to just acknowledge that, like, I wouldn't be a good yoga instructor, but I have such deep respect for the work and the tools of mindfulness or self-regulation or self-awareness are things that I carry with me, and that even the therapy field and the clinical social work field have integrated more in the last few decades. So being someone who's interested in working systemically and holistically, I've been working in community mental health, and then this program where we do work with people in public housing buildings. It exists because in our society there are a lot of people who live alone. Like one of the participants, Kevin Allen, right? You read SSDI applications, it sounds like. And if someone has SSDI, which is something I also became very interested in after doing community work in Seattle, they have a documented disability. Usually they have a reason why they need some sort of accommodation, or they would benefit from ongoing healthcare. But actually, in our society, there's not a lot of explicit awareness of that, or like, for example, in the eviction process, it's not always clear that somebody could be, say, experiencing a mental health crisis that is contributing to the reasons why they're having distress with neighbors or they're behind on their rent. And so that's part of why my program exists, to sort of advocate in that situation. And then, you know, so Kevin and I did meet in one of the communities and buildings where we work, and I think, you know, one thing that, you know, Kevin picked up on is that, like, a lot of people do live alone. They may have some good relationships with their neighbors, but they maybe live far away from other family supports because of where that housing is located, where low, you know, where we're able to build new housing in someplace like Seattle. Sometimes there's environmental factors to consider in some housing. Like, so, you know, you might live next to a parking lot with a lot of buses or a bus depot right next to you. So there's some environmental factors to consider. But really, especially in Seattle, everyone has the opportunity to find providers that they're choosing, to find social support, to be reconnected with friends and family. But sometimes when we're in crisis, we lose those connections, and we, you know, humans are inherently relational beings. And so sometimes, you know, it takes sometimes a little bit more effort and more involvement with other people to help us reconnect. So a lot of the work that I do right now looks like crisis work, and some of it is just working with my colleagues to help people choose providers of their choice, to get connected to things that inspire them, like hobbies, art, yoga, community groups. As we know, through the pandemic, a lot of the things that we used to do that brought us joy were kind of temporarily put on hold. So, you know, our work has been to, like, find new ways of connecting, or to reconnect to those activities and groups that we used to be more connected with. And of course, we have, you know, we have all different cultures. And so another thing that could happen with someone is if they, you know, get some housing and it's great, but it's way in South King County and their church was in, you know, Rainier or South Seattle, like, you know, what happens then? So that's also something that that we have to kind of figure out too. Any more of that question?
Well, that was a great answer. I mean, I think one thing that you really emphasized to me is that a lot of times, unless you are living something or experiencing it, or you have a loved one or a friend, you can only make assumptions about people. And I think, unfortunately, some of those assumptions are negative. It's just like with people, you know, I've heard, I'm sure as you have, people that are homeless or experiencing homelessness. Well, why don't they just get a job? They're just lazy, or they're all mentally ill, or there's just these assumptions that people make that contribute to the problem and will limit people personally from being compassionate, for one thing, but also possibly assisting people. So I think the more people know about people that are different from themselves, like living in I've never lived in public housing, you know, so it was a great experience for me, because for one thing, I met some of those people, because I went to a couple places and I actually talked to some of the people personally. And I think with COVID, that contributes to the stress and anxiety, because we're so isolated now. We're in front of our computers, we put on a mask, go to the grocery store and go home. So I think you've really put a spotlight on, you know, a situation that a lot of people are unaware of when it comes to how human beings are treated and the lives that they're experiencing. I just wanted to know, before we move on to Michelle, is how do you personally deal with stress? And I asked that question because you said something about going camping, and I said, in this weather. So, but what are some of your tips for people who are going, I'm just going crazy here. The kids are driving me crazy. My boss is driving me crazy. What would Shashim do if that happens?
Yeah, well, right. So nature is really important to me. And, I've lived in rural places, I've lived in cities. I always spend time with, under trees, in nature, at parks, you know, walking outside. I love walking outside and even in an urban environment, just seeing things that I have never seen before. There was a brief time when I didn't have a car and was living around Central District, Capitol Hill, and I saw this bookstore that I had never seen before because I had never walked that street. So I love the kind of awareness and mindfulness that comes just from walking. I also have done yoga for off and on for a long time, and during the pandemic, one of my friends had a yoga instructor friend who did a live yoga class, and so when we were kind of in that lockdown phase, it was so nice to connect with people in real time and see faces. And I also have made use of, having conversations with people, friends, even when we were also more isolated recently during the pandemic. And gardening has become more and more important to me. And that's actually supposed to increase wellness. And there's been some studies about that. So I'm a big fan of personal psychotherapy, and of course have done that myself and engaged in that, as well as group work. And just anything also where you're just kind of getting out of your head. So cooking, if that's something but that's meaningful to you, doing crafts, doing art, listening to music when you're leaving work, making sure you're really able to separate your responsibilities from some downtime, and making sure that you're connected to other people is really important. And like I was saying before, we've had to find new ways of doing that when some of our, groups or activities were interrupted. So I'm really active about that, and encourage everyone to think about their hobbies, interests, meaningful relationships, and just how they can stay connected to those things, even if the pandemic has kind of pivoted some things a bit. So,
yeah, thank you. It reminds me of an old song, actually an old Tower song. If I'm dating myself, probably only 3 people on this call even know Tower Power.
I know Tower Power.
Well, there was a song,
I do.
song that had the line, "The best things in life are free." And I think
Yeah.
sometimes people think, oh, I've got to spend all this money and da, 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 da. And sometimes it's just like you said, taking a walk and walking into a bookstore you've never walked into before. It doesn't cost you absolutely nothing unless you buy a book, of course. But I think it's just what you said kind of widens a person's lens. And I think that every little bit contributes to reducing that stress and anxiety. I wanted to go over, thank you, Shashim. And I realize you might have to drop off around 11 or so. So I totally understand that. I appreciate you being here. Michelle and I go way back. We met while I was working in Bellevue, and you were at the YMCA for a while, and very, very involved with working with BIPOC communities, race and social justice, and particularly youth and youth of color. So I wanted to just kind of get we've heard your background, but I want to know kind of like what you're currently doing and experiencing with, and who you're working with as related to the theme, of course, stress, anxiety. What are you seeing in the groups that you're working with?
So I'm currently working with primarily Black youth right now. I've always worked with Black, Latinx, youth of color. And I'm going to digress a little bit because my beginning career with working at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., doing work with pediatric AIDS and HIV. I stay in contact with that entire multidisciplinary team, and it hit me hard with COVID because just like during my entire time working there, the crisis of COVID or the crisis of having AIDS or HIV, it's just one more crisis in a family's life that their youth is experiencing. So I was always struck by the reaction that was expected with a diagnosis of a pediatric AIDS HIV when they're like, but right now I'm experiencing homelessness. Right now my family has no food. So as serious as that is and seems, it was always sort of the reaction of medical professionals is, why isn't there more reaction? And I sort of find that same thing around an emphasis around with some of our families and students around COVID. Well, part of it is, this is just an additional piece of what's already ongoing in folks' lives and the trauma they're already experiencing. And they were already on the edge, and COVID just sort of pushed them off. So looping back around to working with in particular, the majority of students, again, I work with are Black youth, they're high school students. And the transitions happened fast and furious. On a Friday, they were in class. On a Monday, they weren't. On a Friday, they were connecting with peers, classmates, had supports, and with our groups that I do in person, and then trying to transition to a virtual setting. And that in and of itself, and I'll speak to the East Side. This hasn't been the only environment I've been in, but I mentioned the mighty 3%. So on the East Side, the population of Black students in the Bellevue School District in particular that I work with, it's 3%. So we know that racism is there. We talk about, just from a clinical standpoint, there's already a DSM-4, DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual, which all of a sudden gave some validity in sort of a therapeutic setting to what we all know what racism is, and that's traumatic, and it is something that is ongoing. There's not a break in it. It's not something that students experience Monday through Thursday, and then they don't experience the other 3 days. And it doesn't matter whether the socioeconomic range doesn't differentiate racism. You know, that's huge too. And all of I think what really I noticed happening with students is, we as adults don't process the ongoing internalized racism we experience, right? And when we don't have the words which we need to find, it makes it hard for us to support our youth through this process, because we're still processing our own trauma, our own racialized trauma. But it's one of the things that has been incredibly important to me to address before we're then sort of in tandem addressing the trauma that our youth experience as a result of being isolated because of COVID. And I'm trying to connect these dots so that with the students that I've worked with, they took a pause to process because they were out of the institutionalized racist environments that they've had to be in. And for the very first time in their educational experiences, they were removed from that environment, because it is so hard to process the ongoing racism you're experiencing when you're in that very environment. And that is a continual cycle for our students, and then for our families who are lovingly protecting their children and trying to work through all of those processes, that racism is a thread through. And what I've noticed, and I'm so impressed with, and I'm always in awe of the students because they're brilliant. I don't know what I was doing when I was their age, but it wasn't nearly what they've been able to achieve, because they truly have been able to identify things that adults don't. And one of them has been, when they've stepped back, they realized that they began experiencing racism. We had a very amazing conversation and forum around their first recollections of trauma and racism kindergarten, preschool, but they didn't have the words for it. They didn't know one young lady described it as my tummy hurt. I knew my stomach bothered me. And now she's 16, taking a break away from that, what I will use as a toxic environment in an institutionalized system, in the educational system. And she's looking back over, this is what I have truly experienced and endured. And what we've been able to also introduce is healing-centered engagement, which is a move away from trauma-informed practices, because healing-centered engagement, and that's what I've been working on my curriculum around, is focusing on the strength, your strength, not that trauma defines you. I will not, and that's one thing that I really trying to articulate to youth. You are not your trauma. You have lived with such power and such grace and such strength, and that is healing. And we need to always define for everyone, but especially for our youth, that you are remarkable, and the strength that you possess as a Black youth or a BIPOC youth to exist in this environment and really be able to live each day is centered in strength. And we want to center in healing. And that really is that positive development from healing-centered engagement, whereas trauma-informed care, and I'm not going to negate that term because it's incredibly relevant as well. It's just that for me, working with Black youth and BIPOC youth, pointing out that, and especially when you're in environments, and they're in environments where when you are one of the few, they're often asked, right? How are they experiencing these pieces? What has your trauma been? So not only are they being defined by the dominant culture in these settings, by their trauma, they're being asked to be re-traumatized to describe their experiences. So what I really work on is recentering. One, you don't have to say anything to anybody about anything. And I no longer bring groups of Black students, BIPOC students to settings that aren't safe. Not that we did that, but the intention was this community fulfillment of people understanding this is the Black youth experience in these predominantly white settings. But our kids get burdened with educating, not just other youth, but educating adults. And I really just centered them, and they have centered themselves on, this is about us. Nothing about us without us. This is our experience. We're not going to, one, be defined by dominant culture, and two, be defined by what their expectations of our trauma has been. So going back to that healing-centered engagement piece, a big piece of that is the sense of safety and belonging. And that really has been what my groups for Black students and BIPOC students has centered around as well, because I want to make sure that there's always a safe space where they can be with folks who look like them, who have shared experiences, shared life journeys, and they can, for once, during a week, let their guard down and speak their truth and really be supported and feel loved. And that's the sort of the last piece I'll say. I always say, they'll know, if you ask any of my kids, what's Miss Clark's favorite word? Phenomenal. Because I think they're absolutely all phenomenal. And I get a little emotional, but we see them and we respect them and we love them.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I always like talking to Michelle because I usually have 5 or 6 questions lined up, and in one statement, she'll answer all of them. So you make my job easier. But I did want to ask you about challenges. I mean, I think everybody on the call here is in sync with what you're saying. But as a trainer, and all of us work in that capacity to some degree, you sometimes you get that pushback. You're trying to, I don't want to use the word convince, but in a way, I guess you're trying to convince that what you just said is a reality. And that, speaks to what we were talking about earlier about, well, if people would just like work hard, don't do anything illegal, and, this is America, and you can be anything that you want. So I'm just wondering, especially on the East Side, having worked there for over 20 years, are you still running into the pushback or the denial or I don't know, I don't see color.
Oh, Kevin. Yes. Yeah. Well, so yeah, without a doubt. And one of my reasons for starting Eastside Youth Coalition was that very fact. I mean, I worked for and I continue to partner with many predominantly white institutions. But the reason for starting this is because we don't have that time. And I always say this, if you're a Black person, if you're a BIPOC person, our sense of urgency is every minute of every single day. And I definitely feel it with our students. And I always say to people, we have high school students for a finite period of time, right? We have them for 4 years. And I can't sit through another meeting about a strategic plan that's not coming to fruition for another 12 years. My son, my youngest son, he's 26 years old now. And he started in the Bellevue School District when he was in 4th grade. And there are things that we're focused on and promised them. And I think I understand the environment that I must work in, but I also have turned all my energy to, yes, I get the pushback without a doubt. And yes, I feel, because I'm incredibly desirous of our children being in the best possible environments when they go back to PWI environments, that I deal with what that pushback is and trying to continually explain that here is the relevance for having a program or programs that are just spaces for Black and BIPOC students. Why is this relevant? Why should you fund this? Why must this continue? Because these safe spaces are the things that are literally and figuratively saving our students' lives. And again, it's that piece that keeps me going back to trying convincing people that racism actually exists and that our students experience it as we do every single day. And they experience it in so many different ways, because it's not just, I think a lot of times people assume there has been a racialized incident or someone has, a microaggression. Yes, all of those things exist, but it's also every day in curriculum. When our students are sitting in class and they never hear curriculum that's reflective of their experiences, and they never see the greatness of people who were engaged in not just a Martin Luther King or a Rosa Parks, but in the creation of mathematics. And no one says to them that civilization began in Africa, right? That's where civilization began. I mean, I joked with the kids the other day. I said, people say we do have students who are first generation from African countries, but I said, getting defined as African American, I said, you know what, they're really American African, because everything began in Africa. And that again is a source of strength. So I try to deal with the pushback that I get from predominantly white educators and leaders in community with the reality of what our students experience, but I still put all my energy in the journey that students are walking, right? So that they're not always so onerous of having to convince people of their experiences, of their trauma. And that's really the other piece that I'm so proud of students that I've had the opportunity to work with and other BIPOC adults, but in particular students, is they not only recognize how being activist is important, but they also recognize how changing the system from within is important. And they've done a lot of important work. And one of the groups that I do is called Youth in Government, but they look at also the changing of legislation and the changing of policies in school districts. And one arena that they've worked on that's so impressive is the School Resource Officer Program, that because of the youth in Bellevue, the Black and BIPOC youth in Bellevue, that system is being changed and upended. So again, I go back to their power. Yes, we get pushback, but the most important thing is their power and their voice. And I am overwhelmed and impressed every day by having the opportunity to work with our youth.
Great. Well, thank you. Again, I've had the pleasure of meeting them and recording them actually, and meeting them in person. Thank you very much, Michelle. And before we kind of get into kind of a general discussion, I just wanted to have Mike step up to the podium. And in relation to our theme of how do you combat stress, anxiety, and depression during COVID, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the school program, but then also about just who you're working with, who you're seeing, who you're counseling with, what are some of the issues coming up, and what are some of the solutions, or at least some tips on what people can do if they're either experiencing stress, anxiety, or depression, or maybe a loved one is. So the floor is yours, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks, Kevin. And I really enjoy this topic. I think that a lot of what I do in counseling has a direct effect on folks' stress and anxiety. Currently, the school program has done a great amount of work working with folks in the BIPOC community, both in Washington and abroad. Just kind of understanding what people's journey looks like, and just being able to take it one client at a time, one participant at a time, and just really discuss what's going on. So understanding what their challenges are. Not everybody is going through the same challenges. Some people have challenges with work. Some people have challenges with their school life. Some people have challenges with their interpersonal relationships, their family. And, a good counselor should be able to break those down and use good problem solving strategies, being able to kind of weigh out pros and cons of dealing with certain situations in certain ways. And also, school's primary job is to help folks connect to resources, help them understand what their options are for accessing therapy from an ongoing diagnosing therapist. So that's one thing that we do. We provide them with resources. We give them a voice, not only on individual participation in the mental health screenings, but also in group, as well as in an open forum called Let's Talk, which discusses social situations such as police violence, racialized trauma, COVID, vaccinations, things like that, and whatever else that's going on in the world that people are concerned with. And we do that every month. We provide people with free one-on-one mental health screenings with a licensed counselor every single month. I've been doing it since July of last year. We also do both virtual and in-person support. So if you want to see a counselor online, that's great. And, we're working with Department of Health to make sure we're doing things properly as far as in-person supports are concerned. The last in-person event I went to was the Elijah Wan's Hands event in Skyway. Elijah Wan is the is a young boy who was killed, unfortunately, in a gang-related activity. He was mistaken for a gang member and shot in his neighborhood. And his mother created a charity called Elijah Wan's Hands to commemorate and honor her son's name. And she hosted a vaccine event in Skyway at the grocery outlet down there. And they were looking for counselors to provide mental health support. And that's something that school does. We go out to places to help people with their mental health goals and just kind of understand where they want to go with their mental health. And I think it's a great thing. In my work life right now, I'm working 2 jobs. I'm working at Kitsap Mental Health at the Crisis Triage Center. And this facility is a great facility because it provides an alternative from the hospitals. So yeah, we'll have clients that will go to a hospital and get screened for medical, and then they'll come to us to stabilize in a place that's not as intense as a hospital. You can really focus on stabilization on for your mental health crisis situation, and also giving you connection to resources like housing and supported employment and things like that, as well as ongoing outpatient therapy and ongoing outpatient medical provider. So we do that. And I really love this job because it really helps me kind of understand what's going on in the community. I work with primarily folks who are on Medicaid, folks who are living in the streets, unfortunately, or unhoused. And I consider it a really great privilege to work with these folks. I've been working with folks in this community since I started in Washington 4.5 years ago. So it's a really great facility. It's 3 to 5 day stay for people who are in crisis. Anyone can go, whether you have insurance or not, as long as you are able to come to Kitsap County. It's in Bremerton, Washington. And it's a great facility for what it is. So, and then in my other job, I work as an in-home therapist through Talkspace. Primarily, I work with clients who are going through anxiety, depression, experience situations like that, as well as having questions about their career and things like that, because I am a certified rehabilitation counselor with experience with vocational counseling as well. So that's what I do there. I create treatment plans and help people work through their self-care goals. And that's one of the first things that I talk about with folks is, what does your self-care routine look like? How are you taking care of yourself? What are your daily maintenance activities? For folks who have severe mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, I like to work through the RAP guidelines. So helping people with their daily maintenance activities, helping identify early warning signs for crisis, and also crisis management before, during, and after. That's a really big part of the RAP strategy that I like to use for folks. And it gets really good results typically. I also like to utilize an eclectic approach. So utilizing DBT principles and CBT, and just focusing on ways to help, have a really balanced clinical perspective.
Now you're using some, excuse me interrupting, you're using some acronyms. So you said CBT and you threw could you just spell those out for us?
So CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's been around for a very long time. Dr. Beck, who recently passed away, was the person who created it. And what it is, it basically helps to understand behavior and understand consequences of behavior. And it's a really effective strategy. Whereas dialectical behavioral therapy, it was created by Dr. Marshall Linehan. And it's another great therapy that you can use to help people understand how they're interacting with their emotions. So there's 4 principles. There's emotion regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, which includes kinetic mindfulness like yoga and going for walks, things like that, and also distress tolerance. And what I find when I use these principles with my clients, there's a lot of great response there because they're able to work through things and process their thoughts quite effectively. Now, when working with trauma, there's all kinds of different therapies that are kind of beyond my scope, things that I don't practice, like EMDR or eye movement, rapid desensitization, I believe it's called. I don't do EMDR, but it's an effective therapy. But I do like to practice from like CBT, DBT principles specifically, and I like to approach it from like a humanistic perspective. So what is your an existential perspective? So we talk a lot about purpose and meaning and looking at the bigger picture on things. So that's a little bit from where I come from.
Well, great. We have some questions in the chat from William Bear. We have, does mental health support have to be done by professionals? What about trained peer support by people who have experienced healing, like NAMI and recovery groups? And then also, if you just segue a little bit into, and this is where I'll open it up to everybody really, are signs, warning signs. I really want to talk about that as well. So, but first, maybe you could address Bill's question.
I love working with peer counselors. I feel like they can help connect the dots that maybe a client is feeling uncomfortable talking to a counselor because they don't have that same connection. What a peer counselor can do, they can share their experience. They're trained to be able to share their experience as a therapeutic tool. And also they help to bridge the gap. I was actually just talking about this with one of our peers last night at work. And, I've been working with peer counselors since I started as a voc specialist at DSC, and I love working with them. They can connect with clients in ways sometimes that counselors just can't. I don't know what it's like to be institutionalized. I don't know what it's like to have a severe mental illness. I can only go by what I've learned from grad school and dealing with clients. So they have a special connection, and a lot of them are trained in RAP planning, which also is a great tool. It's something that I like to use very frequently working with clients, and peer specialists are specially trained in RAP, which is an excellent crisis management and just really just giving yourself a bigger picture of the mental health strategy, and also empowering clients to manage their mental health on their own. They can create that plan with their peer specialist, with their counselor, to have an ongoing plan that they can update, that they can amend, that they can make into whatever they want it to be. So it's a really great strategy. It stands for Wellness Recovery Action Plan. It's been around for quite some time, and I love using it. I use it all the time. So.
Well, great. And I want to encourage everybody to put questions in the chat or put your email. I wanted to welcome Shasta and Judy as well. And I just wanted to kind of open it up. My first question, and whoever wants to start, is warning signs. Because, we just had yet another school shooting. And we have a situation, I think it was in Michigan. And I think 4 students were killed and others were wounded by a 15, 16-year-old kid. And there were lots of red flags, warning signs. People are scrutinizing how the school responded to it. The parents have been arrested and indicted for, I think, involuntary manslaughter. But what are some of the warning signs? Because sometimes, I read up on this stuff and you see, well, if somebody's not excited about things that used to excite them, or they're quieter, than they don't want to get out of bed, things like that. Who wants to jump in first with some things to look for in a loved one or a friend that might be a warning sign?
Well, I would jump in and say that actually that's. Oh, you can't really hear me?
Well, now you're okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Because it helps you think kind of out loud about what you look like when you're healthy and what it looks like when you're in crisis, or what keeps you healthy and what are warning signs. And so, yeah, things like change in sleep pattern, loss of interest in activities that you used to find interesting or pleasurable, changes in relationships, change in mood, isolation, obviously hearing voices. Those are signs that maybe your health is changing or you're more distressed. If someone just seems like they're more stressed out, that would be a warning sign. But also I do think that Wellness Recovery Action Plan is a great resource for everyone, and also to kind of have on hand as something that family members could maybe use. So you can Google it, and there's some like YouTube and information on their website, and then you can like order the little handbook. But it was started by a woman and a bunch of people in kind of this grassroots way, just kind of getting together, talking about what they needed to do to stay healthy. And so just kind of wanted to plug that too as a way of having a tool to kind of consider, like, are you healthy, or is your loved one, showing signs of distress? And then if you Google crisis connections or King County crisis and commitment, someone there or the website can kind of talk you through what warning signs are, and if you know what you might do to support someone too. That's all.
Any other thoughts from the group here? I see people putting things in the chat, which is great. So write down, or I was trying to save the chat, for some reason it won't save. So you might want to just get a little piece of paper if there's certain things that you see, resources for youth and adults, that that kind of thing.
Can I have a deepening question on that, Kevin, that you just asked? Because for me, I feel like a lot of times the signs are clear when someone's under distress. I think, and I'm not trying to speak for everybody, but I will say for me, the disconnect is, what do you do with that information? Like, it's like, once you like, it's clear to me. And then how do you navigate either the conversation as somebody who's a loved one, or perhaps even an acquaintance or somebody that you like? How do you navigate introducing the idea that there is potentially a problem? So can I ask that?
Well, of course, you just did.
Okay, because I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts.
Too late, you already asked it.
No, sorry, I'm not trying to take your job.
No, hey, no, believe me, you want to take you carry on. This is a conversation, it's not a lecture. Well, I guess one thing comes to mind, and this reminds me of just diversity, DEI training kind of in general. It's like we've done these sessions about how to have the hard conversations, and so things like that. How do you approach someone? And I think it's just like when someone's grieving, the love of a lost one, you've lost a family member, and it's like, okay, there's nothing I can really say or do that's going to ease that pain that the person needs to work through. However, what I usually say is just what I said. I don't know what you're feeling. I mean, I can relate to it a little bit because I've lost people, but I'm here for you. I've noticed, I've seen this work. I've noticed you just don't seem yourself lately. And keep it more in the what I've been noticing, as opposed to, Alyssa, I think you're depressed. Because people will get defensive when you make these definitive statements. It's more like, hey, is everything okay? I've noticed this. Hey, I have some books. Give the person the power and the option to say, yeah, okay, I'll read that book on depression, or I'll go to that seminar. And I mean, one cool thing, I'm not saying it's cool because it's COVID. One thing it is a plus, having to be isolated at home, working at home, is that I don't have to get in the car and drive anywhere and pay for parking and get stuck in traffic. I can just turn on, I could be on, like you, 4 or 5 webinars a day that address this. So the information's out there. I would also tend to try and build some trust with the person. If you don't know them, don't just go right for, hey, Alyssa, I've noticed you look really down. What is your problem? So any other thoughts? Jump in.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, I know somebody wrote in here about mental health first aid. I think that's a great course. I took it in January, and it's a really excellent course on how to approach people about mental health. And also it's okay to express concern. It's like, I've noticed, I noticed that some things have changed and I'm just concerned. And I just want you to know I'm here to support you. Just coming at it from that and being empathetic, showing that compassion is a great place to start. Now, if you're not like a licensed counselor, or if this isn't your client, obviously you're not going to be able to like maybe dive in from a clinical perspective the way a trained counselor would do. But at least expressing concern and support and empathy, anybody can do that. You don't need to go to grad school to do that. So that's what I absolutely recommend. First off, is just giving them a voice, and offering to just give them someone to talk to and express that empathy. I think that's a good place to start. So,
and I was going to kind of chime in as well in the same way, especially with, we were talking about the peer-to-peer, and there's a lot of youth peer-to-peer support specialists. There's actually a peer-to-peer youth support specialist program, which is amazing, because especially with teens, that's sometimes the first stop usually that they're making. They have said something to a friend that they may have never said to any adults in their lives. So there's a lot of knowledge around trauma, distress, suicide, suicidal ideation, that it is a friend, a peer that is hearing this information, and they are worried and they are concerned about their friend. They don't know what to do about it, but they also don't want to betray the trust that is developed friend to friend. And I think working primarily with youth is just also giving them the tools and the comfort to understand that you can listen, but you don't have to be your friend's therapist. You don't have to find solutions for them. Just your very being there and your being in a relationship that is supportive with them. But also, like I explained to all the students, I'm a mandatory reporter too. And that's one thing that I always share as an adult working with youth is I absolutely keep your information confidential. I absolutely am here to support you. But if you share anything about harm to self or harm to others, that's something that I have to report. And that's particularly important in developing that relationship of trust, which is, I think, is sort of the first step. What I've seen happen before in work with schools, and I've been in mental health teams in a school district setting, is that a student isn't known to anyone until they're in crisis. And one of the best things that we can do is to develop as many meaningful relationships when I'm speaking about young people, and this applies to older people too, before the crisis occurs, to do as much. And I know this is a broad brush, so less from that therapeutic standpoint that I appreciate Mike really speaking to, but also just when you're working with larger numbers of students, that bringing them resources, information from an intervention standpoint, and also again going back to their power and how they can support each other, so that when it comes to that crisis and that intervention piece, there's been some relationship development, right? Because we talk to students about, if you have something going on, go to a person you trust. And having that access for young people, to someone that they trust, that they can talk to, is key. And if you can be that person in that space, because I work in the therapeutic space as well. I do PRN work throughout, the kids say your side hustle, but I do PRN work in hospitals as a clinical social worker. It's almost like a substitute social worker going into, so I have the opportunity to do psychosocial assessments. I have an opportunity to do that therapeutic piece in those, finite situations where it's not required that I have an ongoing relationship. But when I'm in school settings and in community-based settings with youth, that relationship development, to then be able to identify when a student is in crisis, the more we can have people like that in those spaces, the better we can serve our youth. And the more people that we can have from diverse backgrounds who are in those spaces, the better we can serve our youth as well.
Great.
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah, these peer programs are great.
Go ahead, Shasheen.
I just want, I think the peer programs are so important, and when you are in that position of being the peer or the family member, because even those of us who are professionals, you know, we have personal relationships too, right? So, but I think some of the concrete things to share with people like outside of this group would be, you know, you increase the level of support, increase everything that makes someone healthy. So, you know, if they have the opportunity to like connect with an EAP, if they have the opportunity to take time off to help their sleep, if you can normalize talking to a therapist or doctor about what's going on, just it's a time when someone's like in crisis or really not doing well. It's just a time when you want to connect to every existing healthy resource that that person has, whether that's professionals or supports, or, you know, being able to take time and connect with an EAP, or but just, you know, just ask someone who the people are in their life that they trust, or if they feel comfortable talking with their doctor or their therapist, or, you know, like, and just, I think if you come at this as from a place of like modeling and just sharing that, you know, these are things that you do as well, people are more responsive. So,
yeah, excellent. I did want to get to a question that Alyssa had put in the chat earlier about what strategies exist for helping people. This is Alyssa Pike, by the way. What strategies existing for helping people who have limited mobility? What exercises can be beneficial for mind and body? Maybe Alyssa P might want to address that. Start.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that, you know, I'm going to say this, and I'm sure you all know this already, but because our brains are so powerful, I'm somebody I identify as disabled. Our brains are so powerful that a lot of times it's, if you are, and I had a phenomenal yoga instructor who actually was not able to walk. And he encouraged the idea of being able to bring movement into your minds. So even if you're not physically moving your body, and you can create a mind-body connection by envisioning yourself moving, you can actually strengthen parts of your body. And if that's something that doesn't happen because your mobility is no longer available to you, then it can still continue to create that mind-body connection as though you were actually doing it. So I always like to bring that in. And then also the fact that there are many movement practices that don't actually require you to move your body. And when people think of, I mean, I just ran a marathon. Actually, even with my disability, I ran a marathon a couple weeks ago. So it's not always that, right? Everyone thinks that when you're moving your body, you have to be like pouring sweat and like, you know, lifting weights and doing all these like, you know, radical things. But, you know, I think that creating, again, this normalization of movement is relative. And so celebrating successes at whatever they happen to look like will be able to bring that in. I also want to say that breathing, while it can be, you know, navigating breathing, I know that a lot of times it can be a trigger point for a lot of folks, but bringing in the idea of breath can also be something that anyone can do. A lot of these practices they try to sell them to you for like, you know, $1 million for a pair of yoga pants, or I don't know what the heck goes on. But anyway, it's like, these are free, right? You can do this anywhere at any time. You can pause and access meditation. You can access mind-body connection through bringing in the idea of moving your body, even if you can't physically do it. And then you can also, of course, create, I don't like the word modified, but create movement practices that are successes for the individuals that are practicing them.
These are some great ideas, and I love the diversity of ideas as well, because we haven't even mentioned medication, and I don't know that anyone would even want to address that necessarily, but we do live in a society as well where people are talking about, you know, I'm taking my antidepressants, I got off my meds, that's what's going on. I'm not a doctor, but I would say that, yeah, there's definitely a role that meds can play. But if you can avoid getting on anti-anxiety, and antidepressants, stuff like that, I think it's great that there's been a lot of other ideas that have come forth with in this discussion. The other thing I just wanted to add before we have some more conversation is in relation to the peer-to-peer support, some of the most satisfying projects I've worked on, especially with youth, is when I've involved youth to address something that affects other youth. So for instance, when I was in Hawaii, I did a series of anti-bullying videos. And rather than have somebody come out, Professor so-and-so from University of Hawaii, talk about, anti-bullying is bad and all this stuff, we had some high school students actually do videos where they are acting out scenarios where bullying is taking place, and they wrote the script, they wrote the dialogue, and it was way more effective in engaging other youth than if you just had a lecture and made somebody watch a documentary. So if there's any opportunities to involve your clients, like at Sound, for instance, I'm talking with one of the clinicians about actually involving some clients who are dealing with schizophrenia or depression or anxiety to do something that's empowering, where they can get something out of it, but also they can then help other people. And because it's peers, it's a little more trust that develops because of that. So we're winding down here, but any other thoughts about stress, anxiety, depression, tips, thoughts? How about, hey, Bill, I was wondering, as a, let's just say, older gentleman, that's what I like to call Bill, an older, more mature gentleman. Are there any issues that you see that relate to age? I mean, I'm just thinking, there's so many people, not you necessarily or me, where people live alone. You live alone, you're widower or widow, and now you're stuck in the house and all that. Are there any things that you come across that affect older people that you see in relation to our topic?
Sure. So one of the things I'm involved in is youth-wise mentoring, and in the Seattle schools invest in youth. And it's primarily older folks. And what I'm seeing is people saying, I didn't know why I'm still around. I mean, that's a very sad place to be. You're not, physically falling apart, but emotionally and socially, that isolation has had a toll. And you do something as ridiculous as go into a classroom and have a kid read to you. And you think, what have I done? I just sat there and the kid read. Hey, that's nice. And that senior, that adult comes away feeling like this was a good day. I'm important. I helped somebody. I have some, at least to that kid, I have some value. And talk about the impact of trauma on kids. Having an adult in their life is the real response to trauma, build resiliency. I work with a kid who experienced a lot of trauma. His dad's not around. Family dysfunction is going on. And I see this kid every week and for a couple of hours. And what his school's saying and his mom's saying is that this kid's turned around. Okay, so for that kid, yay. But then there's this guy, what does that mean to me to know that I have some significance in somebody's life? I raised some kids, I've got some grandkids, but I don't have as much direct involvement. And here's this 10-year-old kid who says, I'm okay. I'm okay. That's a really big deal. If you're all working in this field, you know that there are thousands of kids in your school district who need that, who don't have that today. There's nobody telling that kid you're okay. And from a senior who's sometimes had that existential question, what am I here for? That's been the answer. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I might mention that I had the opportunity to be they called me an Encore Fellow in Hawaii. There's a program that you can find at encore.org, which is basically engaging anyone over 55 and putting them in a volunteer situation, just like Bill described, really. And a lot of the people I worked with were retired, semi-retired, but yet the value that they felt in going into a school or mentoring kids really built their own self-esteem, because a lot of them were suffering, like Bill pointed out, depression and such. And this segues to another question that Kevin brought up. I'm really glad he brought it up, Kevin Allen, is how is the gender divide in the treatment models presented? Generational and societal messages make even the language is feminine, how to get brothers to buy in and participate. And that goes back for me to the whole thing of, when men say, I don't need therapy, I'm okay, or they tell their sons in particular, just suck it up, stop crying, that kind of thing. I know that when I was, years ago, I was contracted to do a series of prostate cancer awareness workshops for men, Black men in particular, because we have the highest rates, and getting 6 or 7 men to sit down and listen and talk about this was not easy. In fact, I even had wives, daughters dragging their fathers and their husbands in and say, you're going to go to this, because it's like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't need to, I don't like doctors and, and all this other stuff. Ironically though, the one time I had a big crowd was when I went to a happy hour down on Rainier. The guy said, look, you can talk to these guys, but the only way they'll talk to you is if you come to their weekly happy hour meeting. And so sure, I went there, we had fried chicken, beer, the whole 9 yards, and they sat down and listened. So my point in saying that is that in engaging the difficult to reach populations, you really have to be strategic. And you can't just send out a flyer and say, hey, come to this, it's important. And Mike everybody read what Mike wrote. There's several paragraphs long, but it looks like it's very valuable. I'm not gonna read it. But anyway, some thoughts about that, about men. How do you get men to go seek counseling? Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I really like this question. It's something that I deal with a lot at work. Essentially, what you said, Kevin, meeting them where they're at. I mean, that's part of counseling principles that Carl Rogers talked about. And meeting people where they're at. I've seen substance abuse counselors go to the bar to meet with clients in group. I mean, it's not the ideal location, but it's a location. I've outreached clients at the hospital. I've gone to jails. I've assessed people laying on the sidewalk. You meet people where they're at, and you come at it from a very non-judgmental approach, using positive regard, unconditional positive regard, and just kind of understanding that, everybody has their space. I do find that a lot of folks that are African-American males that I work with, they appreciate working with me because, I'm African-American as well. And they tend to have more connection. That's not to say that someone who is white and is a counselor can't connect with someone who's African-American, but I do notice that when we have more BIPOC therapists out there reaching out, they do have tend to have a stronger connection at times. Also, like I wrote in the chat, as far as like different modalities, now, I don't have the meta-analysis on this. I don't, I'm just talking from my experience. Using different treatment models like DBT, typically I've seen that be more effective for female clients than male clients. Now, like I said, you can take what I say there with a grain of salt, but Typically, I've used DBT with female clients more than males because there's just, I feel like with female clients, it's processing trauma through DBT is, to me, in my practice, it's a lot more effective, and they're a lot more open to discussing trauma than males are. Now, again, I'll say it one more time. Every counseling profession is different. Everybody has a different approach, but men might take a lot longer to open up about their trauma. There might be some feelings of shame. There might be some feelings of, I should be able to handle this. I'm a man, you know, especially if there's been any discussion of like things that might threaten their sense of masculinity, like sexual assault.
Mhm.
You know, that's something that men typically don't want to open up on as readily, you know. And then,
Right.
you know, and when talking about that, is you really want to approach it from a very non-judgmental, slow approach. Give them a chance to talk about things on their pace. You don't want to be the one that kind of pushes them along in the session when there's trauma involved, because what can happen is you can actually re-traumatize them if they're not ready to talk about it yet.
Mhm.
So that's one thing to think about when talking to men, is just understanding what their concept of their masculinity is and how that might affect their stigma around counseling. You know, I don't need any help. I don't need this. I don't need that. And also, you know, thinking about the cultural considerations as well. I mean, there might be some families like we don't go to the police. We don't go to the counselor. We don't share what goes on in our house outside of the house. And that might be culturally ingrained, unfortunately. And so you have to be able to address those issues as well. Is what is the family dynamic, you know? So just a couple of things there.
Yeah, that's so important, I think, especially for somebody who's trying to be supportive, because like you said, a couple of things I've heard just today, triggering, you know, and re-triggering. And I've been guilty of this a couple of times because I've worked, you know, I work in the media and I do these stories for KBCS, for instance. And I'm one of these people that, you know, I have this mission, like all of us here, to educate people, to let people know about, in this case, it was domestic violence. So I interviewed someone, a survivor of domestic violence, a woman who was in an abusive relationship in Montana. And we did this interview and she was very candid. I mean, so candid that we had to cut certain parts out of it, you know, that she, in describing the abuse that she suffered, the sexual abuse in particular, with from her partner. And we aired the story, and the headline that was wound up on the website at Bellevue College and all over was, and I didn't write the headline, but it was rape by an intimate partner. So in one sense, that was accurate because that's what was happening. But at the same time, immediately we got a reaction from the administration over at Bellevue College, is that some people were complaining that it was triggering, you know, the headline, even though the story was very educational and very empowering. But if you can't get past the headline and you're already triggered, you're not even going to absorb the other stuff that's coming. So it's a delicate walk sometimes, even like when you're talking about racism. You know, there's certain people, they don't even want to hear you mention the word. They just, we can't talk about that, you know. But the word normalized has come up a couple of times. And I do think, you could comment on this, it's important to make it easier to talk about mental health issues. Because in some cases, like you brought up, in certain cultures and with men, we don't even mention that, don't even go there. Any thoughts around that?
Well, I think with youth in particular, just providing those safe spaces. And some of you may be aware or not aware of the incident in Bellevue, and I'm sort of connecting this with Kevin's comment around sexual assault. There was a sexual assault of a student at a high school in the Bellevue School District that was reported, and then because of procedures frankly, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but it wasn't handled in the way that it should be handled. And first and foremost, disclosing anything, any form of abuse, whether it's racialized abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, is incredibly traumatic, and it takes so much strength and bravery to do. So that on the recipient, whoever it is, and in particular in school settings or people who work with youth, you've got to listen, believe, report, and support. But again, you don't have to be the person that's proving or disproving. There's a lot of gray areas in all of those pieces with discussing these issues that I think for especially in the Black community, for different communities, that idea that nothing is said that happens in the context of your home, right? But students, young people get a lot of different messages because they get the message from their home and their families and loved ones not to share anything at all. And then they're getting all of this educational information around, bullying, harassment, and intimidation in the schools, that the first thing you must do is report. But then often with our BIPOC students, they have the courage to report, and then they're minimized and they're not believed. So it's this cycle of, where do I fit? How do I share my truth? And where do I really find support? And I think those are some of the pieces in community as adults, especially Black and BIPOC adults. We can be so much more supportive of our youth. And I love what Bill said, or William, whichever name I should be using for you, said about being a safe adult in that space, because often that's the first moment that something is shared. And then if you have someone to walk that journey with you to the actual reporting, that you've been believed by someone, and then getting connected from there with the right therapeutic supports, which I can say across the board does not happen for, in particular, our BIPOC youth, right? So looking at, and I'm the mother of Black young men, I'm the auntie of Black young men, and I'm the sister of Black men and the daughter of, but I can't walk in the shoes of the trauma that Black men experience. And I really am working hard right now on creating that group and working with Black men who thankfully are interested in creating a group for Black young men to first come and develop the relationships, and then continue to have those conversations around trauma that they may have experienced, as well as then connecting them with other professional Black men like Mike to work with in a therapeutic setting. Because I feel it's incredibly important when I'm looking at my community, that we connect with professionals that look like us and are from our community and have that lived experience when we're talking about sharing trauma. And again, there's so many women in that profession. I am just excited meeting Mike, hearing from Mike, but how important it is to have men in that profession, and then men who are reflective of our BIPOC students' experiences, to talk with them about what their trauma has meant to them. So.
Well, that's great. And I think having more men in the field, I know at Sound Health, we're really trying to increase the number of BIPOC individuals to enter the mental health care field. and also, men in particular, because matching up people, culturally and racially is so important. I mean, I remember one time I was talking to a counselor years and years ago, and I was there to talk about something that really didn't have anything to do with race, but I'm sitting there in front of this very nice elderly white gentleman with white hair, and I'm thinking, I hope I don't get it. I'm glad I'm not talking about anything racially oriented, because this guy is, it wasn't his fault, but there was no way that he was going to relate to what I was saying beyond a certain level. Whereas when I talked to a counselor years ago, when I was married in another life, he was a Black gentleman, and we just connected on so many different levels, because when I said something, he knew exactly what I was talking about. So that is important. And I just wanted to mention one other thing before we kind of just go around and have closing comments, is to speak to your point about Bellevue. There's something brewing up in Monroe, in the Monroe School District, where there's Black, and Bill knows about this. There's some Black parents that have actually pulled their Black children out of high schools because of racial incidents, harassment, fights, and the school district is under the microscope, as it should be now, because like you mentioned earlier, they had heard about it. It was brought to their attention, and apparently it was diminished, it was dismissed, and it was like, well, we'll look into that kind of thing. And unfortunately, just go back to Michigan and think about the school shooter. It's usually when this happens like that, it's not out of the blue. They retrace their steps, and people were called, emails were sent, meetings were had, but yet nothing was done. And now you've got people dead, and then everybody's go, oh, we got to do something. It's like an infection. Infections, you don't see them right off the bat, but once you see the signs, you better deal with it, because it's just not going to get better without treatment. I'd like to go around, and I'd like to give Judy a chance, and Kevin. I'll start at the bottom just with some final thoughts. I encourage you, if you want to put your email in the chat. Alyssa, could you attempt to save the chat? Because I was trying to say, I can usually save it, but it wasn't saved. So let me know if that works or not. But Judy we haven't heard from Judy. I don't know if Judy's just listening, wants to say anything. Here's your chance, Judy. 5, 4, 3. Oh.
Yeah, I'm just here listening in. It's all been very interesting and informative, and I appreciate you all sharing all of your experiences and perspectives.
Well, great. Well, thanks for being with us, Judy. Just wanted to give you an opportunity to say something. I really, really appreciate you, and hopefully we'll see or hear you again. Wanted to move over to Kevin. Kevin, did you have any final thoughts about our discussion today? Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. We're going to go over to
about Kevin. I'm out of heaven. I'm just sitting.
You all right, Kevin? You had some final thoughts?
Well, I'm thankful for the answer, especially the last answer. And I have an interest in it from all different angles, and didn't even talk about could be possible policy parts, but that could be for another day or another part 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for bringing up the idea of suggestions. If any of you have suggestions for topics in the future, please let me know. Kevin just brought up one. This is an issue that, you're just scratching the surface really in 2 hours. It's a very deep issue with all kinds of deep layers to it, and with a lot of historical roots that go back hundreds of years, what we're talking about. So if you have any ideas, because like I said, I do use these recordings for trainings, we put it on the radio, I use it as part of my podcast. So the content will be seen and heard by a lot of people. So let's go over to Bill. Any closing thoughts, Bill?
This is very helpful. I think that as a community, when people are hurt and somebody acts out and then we call 911, I think part of the awareness we have to come to is by the time you've done that as a community, not the individual now, but the community has missed key things that they could have and should have done. You know, the kid who's now taken up a gun and shooting somebody, or for that matter, shooting themselves, is an indication that we have, as a community, failed way back. And we have to take that to heart and say, what do we now do differently? You know, if every kid does not know that they're valued, we've messed up. Way before somebody's doing something horrible, we've lost opportunity. So,
yeah. All right. Thank you, William Bear. Now over to Alyssa Pizzaro.
Yes, well, I think that, I mean, this was such a phenomenal conversation. I'm so honored to have been here and shared this space with all of you. I think that such important points were made by so many of you as far as not allowing trauma to define folks. I think that for me, bringing in the idea of mind-body connection and the fact that trauma lives in our bodies as well as in our minds. So keeping it holistic, and also all the different ways that we can find to navigate these traumas, and particularly for communities of color, BIPOC folks. And, you know, as we're navigating all of the lists, you had such a hearty list at the beginning, Kevin, that you gave of all the things that we're navigating right now, and racism and the structural and policy inequities that exist. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for this.
All right, well, thank you. Let's go over to Mike.
So I thought this was a really great discussion. I'm glad we have it recorded this time. Hopefully the Zoom recording goes well. I think
well, I got the backup. I got my iPhone recording it too. So hopefully between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really raises a lot of awareness of what mental health is, like what this discussion was. Understanding that, you know, some people, there's a lot of stigma out there still about counseling. And, you know, I know counselors out there that don't want to go see a counselor because they're like, I already know what they're going to say. I already know what they're going to do. I already know this. And I have clients that are counselors. I'm like, well, let's keep a dialogue at least. You know, if we can just keep a dialogue with people and develop a relationship, that is the most important part of the counseling process. That's the most important part. And, you know, all the fancy techniques and modalities aside, you know, that's where you start. So hopefully this raises awareness on how to get that question going. If you notice someone is having, yeah, exactly, like medical doctors that smoke cigarettes.
Smoke cigarettes, right?
But if you just go and you can find that place to start. If you notice that someone's behavior pattern is off, and they seem to have some type of, you know, different behavior from normal, and they don't seem like themselves, you know, understanding ways to address that, taking a mental health first aid class, offering to just be a voice, and give them a voice to just talk about the things that are going on. And, you know, just starting there, that's a great place to start. And also understanding how to give yourself space to relax and just take care of yourself. I like to recommend to clients to have a self-care routine when they start on their therapeutic journey. It's a great place to start because it really gives you an understanding of how to make yourself feel better. So, and that's what it's about there. So really good discussion today. I'm really grateful to be here on half sleep.
And you're not dreaming. Whenever Mike comes on these things with no sleep, I always said, Mike, this is not a dream. This is actually happening.
Absolutely.
So let's go over to Alyssa for closing statements.
I just want to thank you all. I found this very informative, and I took a lot of notes, and this is something that I know we need to do more around. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. And I see Claude popped in. We're just closing up Claude, but it's good to see you. We had a great discussion that we recorded, so you'll be able to see this and hear it in its entirety. A lot of good content. And we're just doing closing statements. I've already kind of said my closing statement, so we can just move over to Michelle Williams-Clark with her closing thoughts.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Kevin, for inviting me. And I'm just honored to be in this space with all of you. And I have learned a lot just hearing from you, but it is de-stressing to me to be able to be in this space and talk with each of you and be able to share, you know, thoughts and experiences and take away some tools that you all have shared. It's really meaningful. And be in a community of caring people, because everyone here just cares so much about our community and our families and our youth, and being connected and not feeling isolated in the work, because that happens so frequently. We're just out there trying to, you know, support as many people as we can in our community. So to feel the support that you all have shared today has lifted me up. So I can't say enough for the opportunity to meet each of you and be a part of this conversation today. I thank you.
Well, thank you. And I hope we can, and I think we will all intersect again and stay in touch. The other thing I like about these meetings is that it presents great networking opportunities, in the sense that I've met so many people that I'm now collaborating with via Zoom. In fact, that's how I met Alyssa Pizzaro on a Zoom call about 8 months ago, I think it was.